I want to spend a few minutes talking about polls. As I said in the postings on Moodle this week and next week, we're going to do what I call some of the campaign basics. So we're going to look at polls this week, spend a little time on debates next week, because that'll be a lead into the start of the presidential debates. And for those of you who caught some of the panel discussions in the election workshop, polls were a pretty popular topic, and just want to make sure you're familiar with some of the terminology. They talked a lot about the margin of error in polls, which is kind of a complex calculation, which I don't pretend to know, but the simple way to look at it is when a poll is conducted, it's within a certain percentage point to being accurate. So if something is within 3%, if the margin of error is 3% and the candidates are separated by less than 3%, it really is just a dead tie. And the problem with the reporting of polls, one of the problems, we're going to talk about some more of them today, is that, reporters don't always explain the margin of errors. They see, Biden's ahead by 2 points and don't fully explain that that's within the margin of error, so that, as some of the pollsters and people in the panels last week said, that really should be reported as a tie. They also made a reference to exit polls, which kind of are what the name implies, that after people voted, people asked them a series of questions about who they voted for, maybe why they voted, are they first-time voters, that sort of thing. And it doesn't give you much of an inkling as to how the election is going to go, because the votes have already been cast. But it helps with the analysis afterwards. It gives you a sense of where candidates' strengths and weaknesses are. So we're going to be hearing a lot about those terms in the next couple of weeks in the build up to the election. But I wanted to talk about a couple of things that we should be aware of in polls, and how the reporting of them can be misleading, not intentionally, but just kind of by the nature of the business. So let me share my screen and go through these slides here. Okay. Four things that I want to point out that are problems with polls, and really the last three are related. The first one is that it's easy to be led. By that I mean polling organizations put a certain spin on their polls, different political candidates do, and reporters by and large don't have the expertise or the time to really dig into the weeds with the polls, so that if a poll comes out and the press release says, here's what the poll said, 9 times out of 10, that's how the story is going to read. I'm going to show you a good example of that, after I go through some of these other points. Second one is they're easier to cover. And if you remember, some of what we've talked about with the press already is that, today their reporters are spread thinner than ever before. There's fewer of them because of an economic downturn. There's been layoffs in the industry, and they have to do a lot more than they did 10, 15 years ago. They not only have to report the story, they have to blog, they have to tweet, they have to take video, they have to take pictures, and they have to do that all pretty much in real time. So that if you get a poll that says, Donald Trump is leading in Florida by 5 percentage points, that's an easy story to write. It's a lot easier to do something by numbers to say who's ahead in a poll than it is to do a story about the issues, comparing Donald Trump's economic plan with Joe Biden's economic plan. You really have to dig into that. But this a story that just is numbers. He has 52%. He is, the opponent has 48%. That's an easy one for reporters to write. And when for the press for time, that's the stories that tend to get written more than the in-depth analyses of different policy issues, which actually are the more important stories that people need to know so they can make an informed and educated choice when they go vote. So as a result, polls get over-reported. In the press, you see, a lot of stories on polls, more so than on issues. In my work with the Giandoli Institute, we're trying to put ourselves on the map. We're trying to get more people to know about us. And one way to do that would be if we do polls, because I've talked to other people, you do a poll, it gets picked up by a lot of newspapers, TV stations. Polling is also expensive, so it's a little beyond our budget, but I just, I always suspected that was the case, but in talking with people who run polling agencies, other think tanks like the Giandoli Institute, they all say, a poll is a very quick and easy way put yourself on the map. But as I said, it's also a very expensive way to do it. If you want to do a poll and do it right, it does cost a lot of money. Last point I want to make is horse race issues, which is one of the big criticisms of political reporting, that the stories tend to be about the horse race, the race between the two candidates, who's ahead, who's raising the most money, who's getting the endorsements from who, those sort of things, as opposed to where they stand on the issue. Am I going to be better off, or my kid's going to be better off under, Trump's education plan or Biden's education plan? Those are the things that really affect you. But we're going to see maybe some stories on that, but by and large, most of the stories are going to be on, who's leading in the polls, how does the electoral map shape up, that sort of thing. So a couple of quotes I'm just going to share with you, which kind of underscore some of the issues with polls. They're by, at least the first two, I think there's just two, are by a guy named Larry Bartels, who's a political scientist. Relying on polls gives an unfair advantage to the candidates who are already well known. Think about it. If you're asking someone's opinion on, a whole range of candidates, the ones who've been out there, who've been in elected office, who already, have some name recognition, are probably going to do better than the ones that people don't know about. So, when you look at polling results, take a look at, if somebody's not doing that well, have they been out in the public spotlight for that long? If somebody's been around for 15, 20 years, people generally have formed an opinion on that person. This one also is from Larry Bartels. In covering a presidential campaign, the media tells us more about who is winning and losing than they do about who is fit to be president. And that kind of underscores what I just said. Like, we're going to have a pretty good idea of who's ahead in the race for the most electoral votes, who's winning in the 6 or 7 key states. But we may not, granted, this election is going to be like none other before, but, in the past, there's been less focus on who's the better qualified candidate than there is on who's the candidate who's likely to win. Okay, let me just take this off for a second and set it up. First thing I had on those 4 points was that it's easy for reporters to be led. This example here from July 2011, I started teaching at Bonaventure in the fall of 2011, and I was looking for a good example to talk about some of the problems with reporting polls. And this one came up, and even now, 9 years later, it's still one of the best ones I've seen. So just to kind of put it into context, in the summer of 2011, or maybe late spring, New York State passed gay marriage law, made gay marriage legal. So this polling agency, Public Policy Polling, did similar polls in other states to see what was the likelihood that the other states would follow New York's lead. As you know, I was working in New Jersey. This is the one they did on New Jersey. So you see, this is a press release that came with the poll. When I said the pollsters can kind of spin the way the story is going to be read, this is what reporters get. And you see it says New Jersey supports legal same-sex marriage. And in the lead, it says the Garden State is in favor of following in New York's footsteps. By a 47 to 42 margin, New Jersey voters feel same-sex marriage should be legal. So you read this story, you get it from the pollster, and you say, okay, New York's legalized same-sex marriage. Looks like the sentiment in New Jersey is largely the same. And that's pretty much the way most news organizations covered the story. Here's a couple of leads from different stories. This is the Star Ledger, New Jersey's largest paper. More New Jersey voters support same-sex marriage than oppose it, according to a poll released today. Okay? It's true, 47 to 42%. This is New Jersey Newsroom, which was an online news site. Not sure if they're still around, but it said the same thing. New Jerseyans are telling legislators and the governor they have no problem with the idea of same-sex marriage, according to a poll made public. You can see where they would get that from what the pollster said, 47% to 42%. Okay. This was a Politicker NJ, which is a kind of an inside political thing, but same thing. New Jersey voters support the initiative, 47 to 42%. Okay, all of those are accurate. The numbers are there. More people in the poll supported same-sex marriage than opposed it. But if you look at the way they asked the question, okay, they asked it twice. And this is the one that the pollster looked at. This is the one all the reporters maybe didn't look at, but that they relied on. Do you think same-sex marriage should be legal? 47% legal, 42% illegal. That's what you saw in all the stories, 11% not sure. But they asked the question in a slightly different manner, too. Which of the following best describes your opinion on gay marriage? Say, okay. And there were a couple of different options. Gay couples should be allowed to legally marry. Gay couples should be allowed to form civil unions but not marry. Because at the time that this question was asked, gay marriage was not legal in New Jersey, but a same-sex couple could form what was known as a civil union and would give them, some of the rights that a married couple would have. And then they asked there should be no legal recognition of a gay couple's relationship. So if you look at the numbers, there's my cursor, okay? 41% said yes, gay couples should marry. 40% said civil unions are okay, but not marry. 17% said no legal recognition. So reporters could have just as easily added the 40 and the 17, because here's, cursor coming, there it is. 17% said no recognition at all. 40% said they don't favor gay marriage, but civil unions are okay. So the story could have just as easily have said 57% of those polled do not support gay marriage. But they all went the other way, largely because that's the way the press release read, and because reporters didn't have the time or expertise to kind of dig into these numbers. Patrick Murray, who runs the Monmouth University Polling Institute, when this happened, he has a blog where he blogs about polling as well. And he made these points here, which is what I'm trying to share with you, that the media just went along with the storyline fed to them by the polling firm, even though the evidence was right before them, because you get the press release, but you also get a list of all the questions and the responses. And he said, it was there like a flashing neon sign, but no one bothered to say, how would I report these results if I had something other than the way the pollster interpreted it? So, I said probably the headlines would be different. Now, those first couple that I showed you, they were accurate, 47% to 42%. But there's more to the story than that. So, again, reporters, I'm critical of the reporting. I tend not to be critical of reporters because I know how tough their job is, and I know, they're going from story to story, and sometimes you're under pressure, it gets things out. So if you get a press release from the pollster, it says, here's what the poll says, it looks like it makes sense, the story gets written. So just kind of keep that in mind with some of the other things that I mentioned when I talk about polls. Last item I want to talk about is something that came up in the conversation yesterday with Sean Darcy and Laura Matos, and it was interesting because I did want to bring this one facet of polls to your attention, something called crosstabs. And crosstabs basically not only give you the total results, but they'll tell you how they break down demographically. This is, okay. These are crosstabs from a poll that the Siena Research Institute did. Not sure how well you can see that on the screen, but I'm actually going to upload the file to Moodle. But you can see this is on a presidential poll back in the spring when there were a number of candidates in the Democratic primary. But it breaks it down by party, by gender, political view, liberal, moderate, conservative, union or non-union member, and region of the state, ethnicity, age, religion, and income. So you can see not only who's supporting which candidate, but you can see where their support, is. Is it with women? Is it with people in a certain region of the state? Is it with folks who make a certain amount of money? So this was a poll, just going back here. They asked voters in New York State, if the primary was held today, who would you vote for? And this was back, I think, late February. It's kind of interesting because you can see, Biden, who now is a nominee, only registered 13%. Michael Bloomberg at 21%, Bernie Sanders 25%. So the story of this poll was that in New York State, Bernie Sanders and Michael Bloomberg are ahead of the other candidates. So what I did, and this is something I did for the Gendoli Institute, and it's kind of an example of the way reporters would work, because they break it down by region, and most of you probably know that there's a real split here ideologically between people who live in the New York City area and people who live in the rest of the state. New York City area tends to be liberal, the rest of the state tends to be conservative. I know those are kind of broad descriptions there, but basically that's the way it breaks down. So because this crosstabs break things down by region. You can see how people in the New York City area answer the questions, how people in the suburbs, and they consider the suburbs Long Island, Westchester, the counties right around New York City, and upstate, which is everything else. So you can see if there's any differences there. So that's what I wanted to see. I mean, the poll came out, and I could have written a story or a blog post the way most of the other ones were, which said, you know, Sanders and Michael Bloomberg are leading among New York voters. But I wanted to see if there was a difference between the way New York City suburban voters, you know, felt about their presidential candidates and the way voters did upstate. And let's see, here's here's Michael Bloomberg, and this is a favorable, unfavorable rating. And you can see in New York City, he had a 59% favorable rating. Upstate, he had 25. So less than, you know, he was twice as popular in the New York City area as he was in the rest of the state. This is Bernie Sanders. A difference there, not as dramatic, but in New York City, his favorable rating was 48%. Upstate was 43%. They asked the question this way: if the election were being held today, who would you vote for? They did a Bloomberg versus Trump, and kind of see the same thing there. If the election was held today, sorry, I have a little trouble with the cursor here. 71% of the voters in New York City said they would vote for Bloomberg. As I said, the rest of the state's a lot more conservative. Only 44% of the upstate voters would vote for Bloomberg. Same thing in New York City, only 23% would go for Trump. Upstate looks like 40%. So, so we're starting to see something there, kind of a real difference between the way the upstate voters perceive the candidates and the New York City metropolitan area ones. And again, there was a difference for Sanders too, maybe not quite as dramatic. 64% would vote for him. New York City voters would vote for him, only 50% upstate. Trump, 30% of New York City voters would support him, 42% upstate. So what I did, I'm just going to stop the share and put up a blog post I wrote, which is here. Okay. So this is from the spring. So my lead was kind of what everyone else had. The primary 2 months away. Voters are leaning towards Bernie Sanders because I think overall he had the highest rate. And that there. Yeah, Sanders had the highest percentage. Former New York City Mayor Bloomberg was second, then I have all the other candidates. But here's where I got into some of what I was just telling you. The poll results also illustrate the differences between upstate and downstate voters, such as the conservative ideology of upstate voters. And I'll put this link on Moodle as well. So, and it kind of goes through what I just told you, head-to-head contests against Trump. 58% would vote for Bloomberg, 33% for Trump. And you can see the numbers were much closer, upstate, 44, 40. So again, I won't read it. I'll put it online so you can read it. But I just wanted to show you that that's one way of kind of getting into the weeds of the polls. I had the luxury to do it. I'm not a daily reporter. I don't have to write things right away. I actually emailed Don Levy at the Siena Institute, asked him what he thought about it, and you can see his quote there. This poll, Bloomberg does better. And kind of speculated here. I think I have it in the story. Levy said the disparities are likely a product of Bloomberg's years as New York City mayor. So obviously he was mayor in New York. More people know him. Maybe it goes back to that quote we saw before that, you know, if you're someone who has name recognition, you're going to do better. So that's kind of what I did there. I think I had, yeah, the only other thing I had in the PowerPoint was Don Levy's response, which you can see here. So, anyway, that's just kind of a crash course in polls. Some of the things to look out for, some of the things we can discuss as we move forward. So with that, there's a bunch of other things on Moodle for this week. Take a look at them. If you have questions on anything, as always, send me an email. and I will be back in touch on Monday, if not sooner.